Hello and welcome back to Foreign Correspondents. I'm Tommy Sorang with our panel of foreign journalists. Welcome to the program.
Good to be back.
Thank you for being here. Now, the issue of military exemption has risen as a thorny topic in recent weeks following the country's national soccer team's win at the recent 2018 Jakarta Palembang Asian Games. Concerns over equity and fairness have been raised regarding military exemptions that have been afforded to certain individuals, with some calling for draft waivers to be scrapped altogether.
아니 빌보드에서 1등을 하면 세계 1등, 올림픽 1등인데 그럼 다른 여러 국제 콩쿠르에서 1등하는 거나 뭐가 다르냐?
앞으로는 병역의 형평성과 공정성 부분들을 또 그 정책의 실효성을 부분을 위해서 광범위하게 관련 기관과 협의하고 또 국민들의 의견도 수렴해 나갈 예정입니다.
So in this week's edition of Foreign Correspondents, we sit down with our panel of foreign journalists and talk about issues surrounding military conscription. So guys, what's your general awareness about military conscription in Korea?
Well, I have actually a pretty negative view of it. It's been kind of an issue here in South Korea for quite some time as the government's tried to reduce the term of military service. And if you go back to Roh Moo-hyun when he was the president of South Korea, he even said that serving that military service was, quote, a complete waste of time. And that's the way it's viewed, I think, by a lot of South Korean young men. They view those 2 years or year and a half that they spend in the military as time wasted, that doesn't forward their career or benefit their futures.
I have a lot of friends who did military service, and I've been here for a long time, so a lot of people, male, talk about the military service. And I didn't get such a negative perspective from their testimonies. I mean, many of them were proud to have served in the military service or thought they did something very useful for their country. I would have a different
I mean, that too, but many, for example, they mourned that they lost their girlfriend during those 2 years, or they got some stress from their boss, and there's a strict hierarchy. So I think, or the freezing in the winter, I think many tell those kind of horror stories.
Maybe if the girl is not cannot wait 2 years, maybe she was not it was not a good idea to marry her anyway. I mean.
Okay, that's a whole other episode of Foreign Correspondents, I think. But the basis for mandatory service here in South Korea is outlined in the country's constitution, and conscription has been in effect in this country since 1948. Another factor, South Koreans are particularly sensitive to whether or not public figures have completed their military service, and many high-profile individuals in the country have suffered irreparable damage to their image and careers due to draft-related scandals. So during your time in Korea, were you able to get a sense of the extent to which the public reacts to these conscription scandals?
Yeah, I mean, it's very important. Every time you have a politician who wants to become a minister, and you realize that he didn't do his military service, or his sons, he found a way for his son to avoid it. I understand why people are angry. It's a big deal. I mean, every man has to sacrifice for almost 2 years of his life. So when you see the privilege that some people have, I mean, of course it's a big deal, and that's something I totally understand. I don't think people who are not able to follow the same rule as others are fit for service anyway. So I agree with this anger.
Right. That's why there is this negative reaction when we see people trying to become public officials who haven't completed their military service. So military service is a sensitive topic. It's a thorny issue to begin with, but then its issues have been taken up a notch recently because of the Asian Games, with some calling for the country's military exemption program to be revised. Since its introduction in 1973, many high-profile figures in the sporting world and in the realm of arts have been the beneficiaries of this exemption program. So, Frank, what's your thoughts on this? Is this a good idea to exempt these star athletes and musicians and artists from military service?
No. If we follow the reasoning of Fred, military service isn't that bad. If it's so wonderful, why is it such a big furor when people avoid it or when an exemption is given? You're sending the wrong signal to your young people when you say, if you perform especially well in this endeavor or that endeavor, you get an exemption from your military service. You want the military service something that your young people want to do, not something that they are horrified of doing and that they do feel is a waste of time. The exemption also reinforces this idea of privilege, that those individuals that have performed exceptionally well in certain fields maybe had an advantage that brought about that performance and therefore avoid military service. So I don't think that they should be given that exemption, but I also believe that there needs to be some other very serious changes to military service in South Korea, and we'll get to that later.
Okay.
I totally agree with you. But for some artists, I'm thinking of K-pop artists like BTS. These people are really good for the soft power of Korea. They can play a huge service to South Korea. I mean, obviously, it's good for the country to let these people continue their activities, because if they start their military service, I mean, if you stop your career for 2 years when you're a K-pop star, it's over. So I really think for these people, I don't think we should exempt them from military service, but maybe you should completely adapt the system to let them do it when they are like 30, 40, like whatever. But that would make sense. I agree with Frank. You cannot give privilege to some people and not to some others.
Well, I totally disagree, because like being a professional athlete, being very good, a good singer, that's not a privilege. That's hard work. You basically sacrifice your youth for your career. It's interesting you mentioned singers.
People work in a restaurant is not hard work. Maybe it's people like artists, and there is a lot of people who are not football.
I mean, if you mention the soft power, like let's say a football player who's maybe winning the next World Cup for South Korea, he's good for the soft power too, and he's sacrificing all his youth for his career. If you let him serve for the military for 2 years, it's very serious for his career.
But if we delay, one of the things that Fred mentions, that it would be a good idea to delay military service until later in that person's life, and I really would advocate that, but we're also going to talk about other things, like I believe in the complete elimination of the conscription service, and how it'd be changed drastically, and women brought in to do military service and some civic service, and just very, very drastically changed so that we wouldn't have these problems at all. But if you are going to have a lengthy military service for people like that, it should be delayed until later in their lives, but still performed, and no more exemptions. Athletes receive other benefits. All of those, soccer players that played at the Asian Games that won, they're going to get chosen for other teams. Many of them are going to be millionaires, multimillionaires. They don't need another reward.
Okay, but for example, one brief example, there's already the possibility, if you're a very brilliant, excellent student, you can get an exemption. But then you have to work for the state basically for several years and give your manpower to the state and serve for the country in a different way. And I think that idea is quite nice.
Okay. Now, Fabian, you mentioned World Cup.
Yes.
That actually is not included in the exemption, so we'll go through that.
Okay.
In order to be eligible for the military exemption program, certain conditions must be met. Athletes need to win a gold medal at the Asian Games, or at least a bronze in the Olympics. And as such, at the latest Asian Games, the foreign media zoomed in on football player Son Heung-min and whether or not he would help his country win a gold. So what are your thoughts on other major sporting events like the World Cup or the World Baseball Classic not being included in this requirement?
Well, again, I would stress the point that I don't think that they should be exempted, even Son. He's a great player. I watch him play in the Premier League. It would be a shame if his career was to be interrupted, a real shame for his career to be interrupted. So this current requirement that he serve in the military, prior to a certain age, I think it's even under 30 years old, that would definitely needs to be tossed out, and he can serve his 1.5 or 2 years later in his life when his career is finished, when that window through which his career can flourish closes because his physical attributes have been reduced. that would make the most sense, not expanding it to other athletic endeavors.
No, but you need to be fit to serve in the military. I mean, many people have families once they're 40. If we have the military service as it is right now, then you're basically away from your family for 2 years. You can only see them on weekends.
You can be in a camp and have your family, go back to your family every night. I'm sure there is a way to find you can adapt the system without exempting people. Because you mentioned the World Cup, and World Cup is actually much more difficult to win than the Asian Games. I think we agree on that. So what do you put the criteria? And I mean, we start with artists. Dancer, like classical dancer and classical singer can be exempted, not K-pop stars. Why? What about YouTubers or all the creators? I mean, you have to. Where do you stop? Where do you start? There is no way to do it. So I think the only way is to try to adapt the system so nobody is exempted, but you should adapt the system so the career of nobody is hurt by this service to your nation.
I'm positive to that idea, but the problem is that you will never ever have a fair solution. So probably I would agree to have K-pop, like successful K-pop singers exempted, but then should they be on the billboard charts and in the top 5? Or, I mean, where do you draw the line? That's really tough. It's impossible, actually.
A line has to be drawn somewhere. So in the face of growing controversy, alternative solutions to the military exemption program are being proposed in political and sporting circles.
세계 선수권까지도 포함을 하는 모든 문제를 다시 한번 살펴보고 마일리지를 쌓아가지고 일정 부분 되면은 하는 그렇게 하면은 양쪽을 다 좀 보완하는 그러한 방향으로 가면은 어떨까?
Fabian, back to you. How do you suggest we change the system a bit to make it a bit more fair and equitable for everyone?
Well, I would actually suggest an alternative. So in Germany, when we still had the military conscription, you could basically, if you have reasons for that, religious reasons, or if you're a pacifistic person, like you don't want to carry a gun, you don't want to, shoot with a gun, then you could do some like civil service. You could work in a hospital, in a pension home. And then you also do something for the country that is not in the military. And I think it would make sense here because in Korea, that's the country with the world's most people serving prison time because they are like conscientious objectors.
We had the same thing in France. For example, if you don't want to spend 9 months in military service, instead you could spend 2 years, let's say, like teaching French or technical design to foreign countries or like poor countries. And I think that was great to have this civil service, the possibility open in my family. A lot of my uncles did that. So I think it would be fair as well to include the women now. I think now that we reach a more and more equal society, I see less and less reasons why women should be excluded from the mandatory conscription.
Okay. Now, up until recently, with the exception of Israel, only a select few countries suffering from unrest and instability, such as South Sudan and Benin, had drafted women into the military. However, in the space of the last 2 years, many European countries, including Norway, the Netherlands, and Sweden, have announced compulsory military service for women. And Canada and Australia, which maintain voluntary professional military, they have announced targets to increase the percentage of women in the military to 25%. Women currently make up 15% of Canada's military. The percentage of women in South Korea's military, on the other hand, currently sits at 5.5%. The Moon Jae-in government has recently vowed to raise that number to 8.8% by the year 2022. So why do you think the Canadian government is trying to increase the percentage of women in the military, and what kind of changes would this bring?
Well, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is well known for having a strong sort of opinion on gender issues. I think something like half of his cabinet is women. It's an unprecedented representation within the Canadian government under his leadership. Back in 2000, the Canadian military was at 15%, and they addressed the issue and they tried to get more women to join the military. But over the last 18 years, they haven't succeeded, and it stayed at 15%. So now there's a renewed drive. There was, some research done. The government, contracted some research to try to find out how they can get more women into the military, and it involved things like changing how they recruit women in the military, using social network, changing the, perception of the military to try to get up to that 25% level. Also in the year 2000, they expanded the roles that women could do in the military to include combat positions. But still, again, that didn't have an effect. This is going to be a difficult issue for countries to address. You know, for Canada to go from 15% to 25%, you know, that sounds like quite a job. In South Korea, going from 5 to 8%, again, you know, it's going to be tough. And there needs to be changes both with the functioning of recruitment, the positions within the military, and perception.
Yeah. Fabian, what kind of change do you see, do you expect to see if there are more women in the military?
Well, I expect better decisions. I mean, we see that, let's say, not only in the military, but let's say in football clubs or any place where, or fraternities, student fraternities, every place where there are only males. It's much easier to have a blindly hierarchy, like a strict loyal following, and this whole patriarchal thinking would actually change and I think soften a little bit more. Maybe that's also prejudice, but and I don't want to say that, you know, women per se do better decisions, but I think if we live in an egalitarian society, there should be some sort of balance and mixture. Yeah.
Right. And all women military would equally be dangerous, so I think that it's good to have a mixture. Okay, so let's take our focus back to Europe. One of the reasons for wanting to revive conscription is growing security concerns over terrorism. In what ways do you think conscription might negate or deter terrorism?
I'm not too sure terrorism is really one of the reasons why they bring back conscription. I mean, the French president wants to bring back the conscription, but terrorism has really nothing to do with it as far as I know. I don't think terrorism should be dealt with maybe more intelligence and a better education and a better integration of the poorest people. This is where usually terrorists recruit. I don't think having more military can change anything.
Well, I think it would have precisely the opposite effect. Having a long-standing army is generating, I think, encouraging foreign adventurism in foreign policy. And I think that foreign adventurism, particularly by the U.S., has driven terrorism. If you look at the Middle East and the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly Iraq and the quagmire that developed there, that drove terrorism. So developing large standing armies in Europe that were motivated to act in foreign countries, I think would have the opposite effect. Also, one of the things that needs to change most in terms of terrorism is how countries behave internationally in their foreign policy.
Okay. Now, perhaps one of the most controversial issues surrounding conscription here in South Korea is the issue of conscientious objectors. Since the founding of South Korea, up until last year, 2017, a total of nearly 20,000 conscientious objectors have reportedly been incarcerated. In a 4-year span from 2013 to 2017 alone, roughly 2,700 people were jailed. Amnesty International has called on the South Korean government to immediately release all conscientious objectors from prison and erase their criminal records.
국방위에 지금 법안이 계류 중입니다. 그래서 국회 정상화가 되는 대로 어차피 지금 내년도에 시행하도록 그렇게 내년까지는 하라 그랬잖아요. 그래서 이제 그걸 하는 노력을 해야죠.
병력을 회피하는 수단의 하나로 이렇게 변질되어서는 결코 안 되기 때문에 반드시 그에 상응하는 이런 대체근무 제도는 국회가 충분하게 확보해야 된다고 이렇게 보고 있습니다.
What's your stance regarding conscientious objectors who refuse to receive any form of military training or serve in the military?
I mean, there's of course many objections that those people might fake reasons or come up with invent something. But I think that's not too justified. I mean, there are legitimate reasons. If you're a very, let's say, a very Christian person or Muslim person, then I think your religion does not want you to serve in the military. Maybe for some people, or for example, if you're of a sexual minority, then maybe you wouldn't feel comfortable being that super male hierarchical organization. So yeah, I think I'm definitely pro that. And you know, in Germany, this whole movement started with the student movement, you know, after the Vietnam War, and you know, in Germany we had the Second World War, and people were just fed up with wars and didn't want to serve in the military. Now in our like super complex world, it might sound naive, but you know, I like if young people are idealistic and don't want to hold a gun in their hand.
Sure.
I mean, I think that if you don't want to learn how to kill other people, you have your right to refuse to learn that. I mean, it seems to me like really a basic right. And I'm very happy that the South Korean Constitutional Court in June decided to ask the Korean government to find a solution for conscience objectors.
I have to agree with these guys. You got to let those people out of jail. You're not doing the country any service, and require them, however, to serve some type of civil service.
And you know, even if you don't go to jail, I mean, it's difficult for conscience objector in Korea to get a job. Many companies will ask you for military records. You feel ostracized. You can be despised by a lot of other people. I mean, your social life will be hurt already.
Right.
And I agree with you. I mean, there is many things you can do without having to learn to use a rifle. You can be a male nurse. We discussed that once. You can mine sweeping. You know, like there was this discussion, or maybe we should teach conscientious objectors to learn how to demine. There is many things that are peaceful that you could do. And that can be very useful for your country.
Definitely. So going back to the Supreme Court ruling this past June, according to a recent survey, 6 out of 10 respondents said alternative service should last between 1.5 and 2 times longer than regular service in the military. So keeping in mind that regular military service is around 21 months, how long should alternative service be?
So if you want the alternative service to be 1.5 or 2 times longer, then the military service should be below 1 year, because there's no way that you can demand from a young person to serve for 4 years or so.
I think it should be scaled so that you get enough people in the military. If you get enough people in the military, then I think it should be the same period of time. If you're having too many people, choose the conscientious objector route, and you're not getting the numbers of people that you want in your regular military service, then just increase the amount of time that they have to spend there.
Then would you update this on a yearly basis?
on a yearly basis, and then some years you'll fall short, and then the next year you increase that service term a little bit to make sure that you get the numbers that you want in the service. But I think what really needs to be done is an entire overhaul of the entire system, and in recognition that group of people, I think it's 600,000 or so, they're not as useful as having 100,000 of them be a professional army, and the other 500,000 train for a short period of time and then be on call and well trained to fulfill certain positions.
In light of improving inter-Korean relations and the possibility of a formal peace treaty being signed, how do you think conscription will change if a peace treaty is indeed signed?
Well, I would hope that it changes regardless of a peace treaty being signed. I don't think that, the threat posed by North Korea is that serious now, and I don't think that it's going to change dramatically, suddenly, with the signing of a peace treaty. That's a piece of paper. That's not North Korea moving all its troops away from the DMZ. One of the measures which it has taken, and even that isn't a comprehensive shift in the potential threat posed by North Korea. A vast reduction in its military service, that's something like 10 years right now, and a vast reduction in the number of troops it deploys, yes. And a big change in terms of inter-Korean relations and engagement and exchanges that take place. Those types of real things. But primarily is you can more effectively manage your military and military service with a shorter term and a larger professional army.
I think the geopolitical situation is a special one in Korea, and the military conscription, we criticize it for many reasons, but I personally, for example, now when I look back, for me being a young man, I totally didn't want to go to the military, but now I think actually it could have done me quite well. And the idea that you actually do something for the state that gives you a lot of benefits, you grow up there. I mean, everyone who grew up in South Korea or in Germany is quite privileged and does enjoy some benefits, and you give something back. And I think that's actually not too much of a bad idea.
And even if we live in a very peaceful world, I think civil service, that's something that is short enough, but something you do for the nation, for your country, for your fellow countrymen, I think that's a good thing, yes.
All right, we'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for your input. Okay. Now, despite the recent wave of dialogue and reconciliation with North Korea, the peninsula remains split in two, the only divided nation in the world. And as such, defense and security still remain top priorities for South Korea, and hence the controversies surrounding compulsory military service. Nonetheless, we do hope that continued public debate over these issues will eventually steer the country in the right direction towards unity and reconciliation. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye.